Okay, are we ready in the back? Yes. Okay. And the microphones are on?
Who does that?
Is there translation?
Translation is, yes.
Okay.
Because it's broadcasted, but everybody will. Does anyone need headphones? You can bring them. There's someone.
It's running.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Jewett. I'm the Regional Director for Eurasia at the National Democratic Institute in Washington, and it's great to see you here this morning. You see before you a joint delegation of the National Democratic Institute and the European Parliament. As Ukraine approaches a presidential election in March and parliamentary elections in the fall, this delegation convened to assess electoral preparations, review the broader political environment, examine factors that could affect the integrity of the process, and offer recommendations that could contribute to credible elections and public confidence in the process. The cooperation of NDI and the European Parliament on this mission is really symbolic of the shared European and US commitment to a fully democratic future for Ukraine. And speaking personally, I'm very proud to be collaborating with my colleagues here from the European Parliament. During this week, the delegation held meetings with political parties across the political spectrum, potential presidential candidates and their campaign teams, citizen monitoring organizations, representatives of the media, government leaders, election commissioners, members of parliament, and representatives of civil society and the diplomatic community. Based on these discussions, we are releasing today a statement of our findings, including a series of recommendations that would strengthen the process. Our statement is offered in the spirit of supporting and strengthening democratic institutions and processes in Ukraine. This mission is the first step in a comprehensive election observation effort that will include long-term analysts who will follow up on the pre-election mission's findings and international observation delegations around Election Day in March. The delegation expresses its appreciation to USAID, which funded NDI's participation, and of course to the European Parliament. The NDI delegation was led by Derek Mitchell, in the middle of the table, president of NDI and former US ambassador to Burma or Myanmar, and William Taylor, executive vice president at the US Institute of Peace and the former ambassador to Ukraine, familiar to many here. The European delegation was led by MEP Dariusz Rosati from Poland, and from the European People's Party. Other members of the delegation included Rebecca Harms, MEP from Germany in the Green Party, Christina Hartman, an elections expert and political consultant, and also a recent candidate for the US Congress, Patrick Merloe, director of NDI's electoral programs based in DC, Mary O'Hagan, at the far end of the table, director of NDI's programs in Ukraine, Gerard Quill, to my right, head of unit in the European Parliament's Directorate for Democracy Support, and myself, Laura Jewett. The format for this morning is that several members of the delegation will make some brief remarks, then we'll have time for questions and answers, and we look forward to hearing from you. So to introduce key points of the statement, I will turn to Derek Mitchell.
Is it working? There we go. Okay. Okay?
No, it's
All right. Sorry. Thank you, Laura. Thank you all for coming this morning, and all those live streaming out there as well. Thank you for tuning in. Let me reiterate a few of the points Laura made very quickly. First, On the partnership with the European Parliament, I want to add my thanks and appreciation. We had never done this before as NDI, to work in partnership with the European Parliament on something like this, and it has been extremely productive and fruitful. And I'm very grateful to our colleagues here on the table and all those who supported you during this week. I want to thank as well the NDI team here on the ground, led by Mary O'Hagan at the end. They did absolutely outstanding job in organizing all the arrangements, and all the interlocutors that we talked with this week, which was a full spectrum of people inside and outside of government, civil society, et cetera. The input of all these folks were absolutely critical to the results of our mission and the statement that we were putting out. NDI has been here in Ukraine and invested in the political development, the democratic development of this country for more than 25 years. So we are here this week to continue that work at a very, very critical time as an important election year approaches. We were focused particularly on the presidential election, but also the election season, which continues into the parliamentary elections later in the year. The Ukrainian constitution states very directly that sovereignty resides in the people of Ukraine. And the way to measure the will of the people of Ukraine is to have elections. So elections are absolutely critical for the sovereignty of this country. Many interlocutors told us during the week that there is much at stake in the upcoming elections. In the aftermath of the Revolution of Dignity, this series of elections is absolutely critical for the future of the country. And in particular, it's undertaken during a time of war, with the specter of war, the shadow of war hanging over, with a neighbor with a clear intent to interfere, if not influence, the result of this election, or these elections. That vulnerability is felt very palpably here. We heard it from our interlocutors on a regular basis. And at the same time as we heard that, we were also impressed by the determination and the resilience of the people of this country to maintain sovereignty, to maintain its self-determination in the face of this challenge. Many of our countries, certainly my country, the United States, and others here represented, have experienced Russian cyber warfare, have experienced this kind of attack. The intent of such aggression is as often as not to disrupt, if not undermine, the unity and the stability of democratic countries. But again, we are impressed by the resilience of the people here. They are on the front lines of this challenge, and they deserve our admiration, they deserve our support. And that is what this week was about, that is what NDI is about, and I know our partnership with the European Parliament, that's what that was about. Finally, I just want to say, in the statement, when you see it, you will notice there are 51 recommendations. We will then, in the press statement itself, rather than the broader statement, we have some priority points that we make. But underlying those points are some very fundamental principles that go into a successful election, and they underlie a successful democracy. That includes communication among all stakeholders, transparency of government with the governed, and vice versa, an ethic of cooperation, of openness, of accountability to ensure that there is protection of political space, and that there's no sense of impunity that can result, that can develop within the society, that there be inclusion of all the different aspects of citizenry of this country. And through all that is gained social trust. Only through trust in a country, within a country, developed painstakingly through the diverse components of a country, can you have a stable election and a stable society. And that's what underlies all of our recommendations, is to affirm that ability to build trust through this process and to maintain that unity and stability through the end. So you'll see that suffused throughout our conversations and throughout our recommendations, and you'll hear from my colleagues some more specifics in that regard, and we can take questions following those conversations. So with that, thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dariusz Rosati. I'm a member of the European Parliament. Next to me is Ms. Rebecca Harms, the other member of our delegation. I would like to recall that the European Parliament has been involved in a number of international pre-election and election observation missions here in Ukraine, always with the aim to help Ukrainian authorities and Ukrainian people to have fair and free elections. But this is for the first time we have an opportunity to work together with National Democratic Institute from the US, and we are very glad to have this chance for this common work. This is a sign of transatlantic unity when it comes to Ukraine, but also a symbol of solidarity with Ukrainian people and a demonstration of our firm commitment to Ukraine's democratic and sovereign future. We would like at the very beginning to recognize important progress that has been made by the people and government of Ukraine in the last 4 years, since the last elections back in 2014. And this is all the more remarkable because this progress has been achieved in a very difficult environment. The country has been facing and still faces aggression from the Russian Federation. It is hit by a hybrid warfare. It has gone through deep recession. And in spite of that, it has achieved, as I said, important progress in implementing very crucial reforms, and for us, the fact extremely important, it has managed to sign with us the association agreement with the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement being part of it, and also a visa-free regime. I would like to commend the Ukrainian society that, in spite of all these difficult conditions, these successes have been achieved. Needless to say that the European Parliament and the NDI, and more broadly the European Union and the United States, will continue to stand side by side with Ukraine in the face of the external aggression, and we would support continued democratization of the country as demanded by the people during the Revolution of Dignity 4 years ago. What concerns us especially right now is that the disinformation war has intensified recently with the clear intention to disrupt, confuse, and create divisions among the Ukrainian people during these incoming elections. We raise this point and we raise the flag because I think the country has to be prepared to face this disinformation campaign, which is potentially very, very harmful. As stated by President Mitchell, the recommendations that we offer in the joint statement are meant to encourage the Ukrainian authorities to implement key reforms in the electoral legal framework, but also beyond, that would allow for the elections to be free, fair and undisturbed, and that the result of the election would lead to a strong government that would continue reforms and democratic transition. I would like to declare that, of course, the European Parliament fully endorses the joint statement and what has been just said by President Mitchell. And now I would like to ask my colleague Rebecca Harms to highlight some key issues that we found extremely important and we think should be prioritized in the activities in the run-up to the elections. Rebecca.
So thank you, dear colleagues from NDI and Dariusz for this very good experience of the cooperation here with people from the United States, from Washington and from Brussels, engaged in this process in which we see ourselves together with the Ukrainians. So I myself have been observing the elections in Ukraine since 2004. So since this stolen vote, and I missed only the last presidential election because we had the same day European elections, and I see our recommendations which we developed together also as a result of the experience we have in the development of election law and code in Ukraine. And I would like to underline some of the key recommendations which we agreed to in the paper you will get later here by staff of NDI. So in relation to the electoral framework, for us it's quite important to remind everybody that in 2014 there was the coalition agreement which included a clear commitment to adopting to full proportional representations. And we still think that this is a major step to better functional democratic process and better representation or better democratic representation in Ukraine. We stress that the Parliament still has time to address this issue and adopt the draft electoral code, which is currently under discussion. We met yesterday the Speaker Parubi, and we know that it's quite a difficult process ahead. We know that there are thousands of amendments, but we would like to encourage our colleagues to continue this difficult process. And in addition, also after a meeting with the Central Electoral Commission, we would like to recommend that the Parliament should expeditiously pass legislation that would enfranchise internally displaced people and internal migrant workers, so strengthen electoral justice and give to all Ukrainians the right to really vote, the possibility to make use of their right to vote. We recommend to establish an enforceable gender quota in the parliamentary election law and provide the CEC with the authority and resources to effectively discharge its responsibilities and upgrade its information technology and cyber security. And there is another very important topic which has been discussed so again and again in this pre-election mission. There is a high level of attacks aimed at civil society activists and journalists, and we really call to our colleagues in Ukraine on the judiciary and law enforcement authorities. First of all, they have to respond immediately to any reports of threatening or intimidatory behavior, ensure that justice is done throughout the country. Impunity is one of the complaints we hear across civil society groups, and this has to end. The Ukrainian authorities and the internal community should support civil society groups in their efforts to monitor election processes and encourage citizen engagement. Civil society organizations should systematically monitor violent attacks. And since we are at the 5th anniversary of Euromaidan, I would like to use the opportunity to say the major change which we thought has been achieved in Ukraine was better relation in between civil society, activists, elected politicians, political parties and government. And I think Ukraine really needs to return, all sides have to return to this achievement, which was so important as an achievement of Euromaidan. And in this, I think one of our recommendations is key. We ask candidates and campaigns to consider agreeing on a code of conduct or a declaration that makes clear they will abide by the law and that violence has no place in the electoral process, and urges law enforcement bodies to investigate cases impartially and in a timely manner. I think that's what I want to say now.
Thank you. It's great to be here in Kyiv. It's been an honor for me to join NDI. Thank you for the invitation to join this delegation. It's been a real opportunity for us to have conversations with Ukrainians and officials, non-officials, in and out of government, candidates, candidate staffs. So it's been a great week. And it's, to me, the last before your questions, just to essentially reinforce what Ambassador Mitchell has said and Dariusz Rosati has said about the accomplishments of Ukraine in the face of aggression by the Kremlin. It's difficult enough to put on free and fair elections when you're not at war. But when you're attacked by a neighbor and have to fight on both fronts, both the Eastern Front against the Russians, as well as all the challenges of fighting corruption and putting together elections, reforming institutions, this is a challenge that the Ukrainian people and government have addressed. So it's great for us to be here. I look forward with the rest of my colleagues to your questions, and I think, Laura, it's back to you.
Yes, thank you, Bill. So the delegates have raised a number of issues. The statement has in it 51 recommendations. I refer you to the statement to see those. I would just like to highlight several points that we found were particularly important that have not been raised yet. As referred to, countering Kremlin interference must be a top priority to safeguard the stability and unity of the country. Also, social media and digital platforms have a responsibility to help Ukrainians in this endeavor. For citizens to make informed choices, all campaigns and candidates should have equitable access to the media, and the harmful effects of disinformation must be mitigated. Efforts should be taken to strengthen the bodies and organizations responsible for preventing political corruption and curbing the role of money in politics, which originates both domestically and abroad. When it comes to campaigning, the maintenance of national cohesion will depend on campaigns that are constructive, that seek to unite rather than divide, and respond to the aspirations of the Ukrainian people. And Ukrainians clearly support greater equality between men and women, so the underrepresentation of women in political life is quite striking and should be addressed. Just a few recommendations that have not been mentioned yet. Candidates and political parties should conduct constructive issue-based campaigns that avoid amplifying societal divisions. The Parliament should reinstate the budget proposed by the government for the National Broadcasting Company of Ukraine. The Central Election Commission should embrace the roadmap for progress that was outlined by civil society groups. And Facebook should establish an office in Ukraine and, along with other digital platforms, partner with Ukrainian stakeholders to monitor, expose, and counter disinformation. And the media, whether traditional or digital, should label political advertising. Again, there are additional recommendations in the statement, and I recommend those to you. And we'd be happy to take any questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm Jim Brook, Ukraine Business News. I've covered several elections here. Obviously, the Kremlin disinformation is a new front, but going back to what was done in the past, if you look at how Ukrainians cheated among themselves, stealing votes in the frenzy of the election night, what should be done, or what can be done, or what is going to be done? It's very nice to have a relaxed press conference now, but things get very tense on the night of March 31 and when the runoff takes place. What should be done in the next 4.5 months to avoid that chaos and 1 a.m. cheating and stealing of votes?
Pat, would you like to address that question?
Thank you. I mean, like you, I've been here for several elections in Ukraine, and of course, my role at NDI takes me to elections around the world, more than 65 countries. The first thing, of course, is to strengthen the role of the electoral authorities so that the kinds of things that you talk about cannot take place. And for them, they have to recognize that to handle and deliver a credible election must start and end with building public trust. And as Derek said, the inclusion in the process, removing barriers to the inclusion, transparency in the process, and accountability in the process are needed in order to get there. So, some more specific things on transparency. The Commission itself should be allowing the public to understand how it works, publishing its agendas, the draft resolutions, its decisions that are taken. It should be embracing open data principles, for example, so that there can be examination independently of the voter registry, and in particularly, as you raised the question about election day and election night, to allow observation to take place inside polling stations by the candidates and party agents, but by the independent civil society groups. In particular, when it comes to results, there's a strength in this country in witnessing results counted at the polling station and recorded at the polling station. Those results, the copies of those results, should be given to the media who are present, to the citizen observers who are present, who in this country, the OPOR organization, as you know, has done statistical samples and analysis based on that, the quality of the process in the polling station and projections of what an accurate result would be. These all help to build public confidence and in effect deter the possibility of post-election violence and tension. So there are a few of the kinds of things that can be done. Inclusion is terribly important in all of this. That is the liaison work between the Election Commission and the candidates and parties, civil society, the work that can be done to ensure full participation of women and other groups in the process. I could go on about administrative effectiveness, but I think if you're looking for the crunch that you pointed to, Election Day, those are the critical steps that need to be taken to inoculate against disinformation and to bring down the kind of tensions that you allude to.
Yes.
Morning, my name is Maria Ulyanovska. I'm from Hromadske International. So the question is concerning Russia, how to eliminate Russia's inner and outer threat in Ukrainian elections as well, and do you support the closure of Russian TV channels in Ukraine? Thank you.
Bill, would you like to try that?
Sure. Every candidate or potential candidate that we talked to identified this problem. This is a well-known phenomenon. So the first thing that we can do, and that we've tried in the United States, people have tried in Europe, is to let the folks in Kremlin know that we are watching what they do, both in official channels and public channels, but also in private channels, to be sure that they understand that they're not getting away with this. This is a deterrent as well. On your question about closing TV channels, this is difficult, and we had good conversations with people in and out of the government on exactly this. On the one hand, everyone agrees that freedom of the press is important. and that should not be inhibited, constrained. But on the other hand, there's real damage that can be done by this kind of just blatant propaganda and false information that's put out. So it's a tension. Our government is looking at this. The Ukrainian government's looking at this. European governments have this challenge as well. It's a balance. It can't be the case that you can say anything in the press. And yet, there's this important principle of freedom of the press. So others may have thoughts about this. I'm happy to defer.
Just comment on this. I mean, elections by definition really, they sow a certain type of division. You're just trying to distinguish yourself from your political opponent. Political divisions are natural in election. You want, again, social divisions though, you have to be careful about those. So, I mean, the Russians will take advantage of any element of social division. They're opportunists. They'll find those divisions and they will exploit them. So one way to prevent or to inoculate oneself against it is to allow for the natural political debate, political contest to go on. But ensure that that political contest does not bleed into use of techniques or messages that exacerbate social division. And we make that point in the statement. Once you do that, once you play on some of these foundational issues of the country and such, then the Russians can much more easily play indirectly, but also through, as we mentioned, digital platforms like Facebook or others. So that's why we call for Facebook explicitly to leave the office in Moscow and come to, they can maybe have it in Moscow, but have also an office in Kiev with Ukrainian speakers, with folks who are focused 24/7 in a war room environment. They have this. They had this for our election, recent midterm elections, and for others that they tested kind of 24/7 war room to ensure that their platform is not used for misinformation, for hate, to exacerbate social divisions that create instability, that really undermine a society in a country. So I think there are responsibilities by those on the outside not to create problems. There's certainly a need for more digital literacy internally so people know what they're seeing and can identify when they are being exploited potentially by Russian disinformation. You can have, for instance, we talk about advertisements on TV that should be marked who are the funders of that. So there's more transparency, the better. The more that society is working together during the electoral period and there's confidence in the process, then the Russians have less ability to exploit those divisions for their own ends. So the things that can be done, even if they try through other methods to hurt the stability, security, and unity of the country.
Rebecca?
Yeah. So I would like to add that there is a big debate also in Europe going on how to deal with Russian organized propaganda channels. But whether you forbid them or whether you offer reliable alternative media programs which are not meant as propaganda but as real information alternatives, there is the difference in the decision-making process. And as long as we are discussing in Ukraine so the improvement of electoral laws and electoral code in the context of elections, so every 4 or 5 years we are also discussing how to improve the media environment in Ukraine. And one of the recommendations we also give is after a good decision for public broadcaster in Ukraine, so our colleagues in Rada should live up to this decision and give proper budget to public broadcasters in Ukraine. And for the rest of the media landscape, so a good regulation, transparency, and also good rules, as have been mentioned, so are important. My strong conviction is that we will not be able to fight propaganda by propaganda, but by strengthening quality journalism and independent journalism.
If I could just add to that, the importance for citizens to remain vigilant, and again, strengthening, as Derek mentioned, digital literacy, but ensuring that folks are aware and that they can start to become better arbiters of information. That's not the silver bullet. That's not the only thing that needs to be done, but we all have a role to play.
Thank you, Christina.
Olena Ramoska, Radio Liberty. I have a question, more like technical question. Did I understand correctly so that you will be monitoring the whole campaign during the election day itself? And do you expect that your recommendation and your presence during this electoral campaign will improve it somehow?
Thank you for the question. And yes, that is our hope, that we can contribute to the discussions and the conversations about the electoral process and help all of the Ukrainian stakeholders find their way to a process that they can feel confident about.
Let me add just to that. The fact that you see two institutions working together here is an indication of what we'll continue to see going forward. The European Parliament works, as you know, in election observation with the OSCE in their long-term efforts. We work very, very closely with them. We also link to the credible organizations in this country that are monitoring elections. The CVU, Committee Voters Ukraine, the Opora organization with their long-term efforts. And we are looking also to help coordinate with the efforts that are aimed at the media disinformation and how to counter the other kinds of Russian interference in this election, which are violence monitoring, money laundering, those sorts of things that sometimes fall outside of the election arena but have to be taken into account so that there can be a more coordinated information sharing and to bring more attention to the kinds of issues that have to be looked at. Together, those can complement one another and help empower the citizens of this country that have been showing, an incredible resolve to have not just credible elections and more credible elections each time, but to advance the democratic process with more openness and more accountability in fighting corruption and bringing about a political process that's responsive.
Another question is on the electoral code, because at the beginning of the parliamentary season, the deputies promised that the code will be adopted by the end of autumn. It's almost the end of November, the clock is ticking. Do you know, have you been promised any specific time frame when the code would be passed in the parliament? And the second part of this question is, there is an issue that the code might be valid not for these elections, but for the next ones. Do you know anything about that? Thank you.
Pat, would you like to respond to that? Oh, I'm sorry, was there someone else?
No, you are the expert.
You always have to be careful if someone calls you an expert. I can say that we've looked at this closely and that we have been working with our two institutions, with the Parliament, and a set of dialogues around a whole number of issues, the Jean Monnet dialogues, over a period of time. That we have raised during our meetings here, as Rebecca pointed out, that there still remains time to adopt a comprehensive election code, which there has been a first reading for that to happen, but there needs to be a consensus to move that forward. Should that consensus not be reached, there are a number of very important legislative initiatives that have to be passed nonetheless, which relate to electoral justice and accountability, which relate to gender quota, which relate to a number of other things that are mentioned in our report. Some of them have gone through first readings, some of them are ready to go, if you will, and could be fast-tracked, and we think they should be fast-tracked. No promises have been made, but we have entered in discussions and urged that these things be addressed with very close attention and in a timely manner.
Hi, I'm Vladislav Davidson, chief editor of Odessa Review. I'm an American journalist based here. I was born in this part of the world. I've also been to a few elections here with IRI. There is an issue in this country that there's actually no real politics in the sense of broad membership-based political cohesion in terms of ideology. There really aren't political parties here in the sense that they have intellectual, policy-based arguments. There's no I mean, with a few regional exceptions to that, they're not really ideologically based, membership-based parties. So there's no real right or left. There's no distinction between worker interests and capital interests. The real distinctions between different political wings in a liberal democracy don't really happen here. People argue about corruption or anti-corruption or pro-East or pro-West or up or down, but there's no real politics here on the policy or intellectual level for the most part. So how do we help them build membership-based political parties?
Mary, would you like to respond?
I think you're right to say that that is the way in which political parties traditionally have been characterized in Ukraine. However, there have been a lot of changes and efforts made since 2014. Most of the political parties that will be contesting the next parliamentary elections emerged after the revolution of day. Not all, but most. And many of those parties have sought, in their own ways, to address some of the shortcomings traditionally noted in the way that parties have organized. I think for the National Democratic Institute, for whom political party development is a high priority activity, we work across a very broad spectrum of parties, and we have certainly seen some progress. That is not to say that there isn't further to go. I think I would add that traditional ideological divisions between parties may not be perhaps the top yardstick that one would use to assess political party development. I think what Ukrainian people want in overwhelming numbers in every region of the country is political parties that represent the interests of citizens. And on that, of course, this is always an ongoing process in every country.
Dear colleagues, do you have more questions?
Okay. Thank you very much for your thoughtful questions and for your time. And we hope you will review the statement.